Good afternoon and welcome to the CAF Philanthropy Summer Series. This is Webinar 1 in this year's Summer Series. I'm Joanna Walker. I'm the Head of Private Clients at CAF, and I'm delighted to welcome you this afternoon to what should be a really interesting discussion with our wonderful guest speakers who I will introduce to you shortly. Thank you for joining us. If you're just dialing in now, we're hoping to keep it very interactive, so please feel free to send us your questions throughout the conversation and throughout the broadcast, and we'll do our very best to answer them throughout the seminar and the webinar. So today, our first in our series of Philanthropy Summer Series webinars is around the subject of direct cash giving. The reason we're putting these seminars together and these webinars is to enable you, our stakeholders, contacts, donors, clients, to understand much more about some of the key issues that you've told us you are interested in today. International development is something that many people are particularly interested in and came across as the #1 reason our donors want to support organisations overseas. So we're focusing on an issue within international development today on the issue of direct cash giving. What is direct cash giving and how does it work? First of all, I'm going to introduce my 3 guest speakers who are experts in the field, and we're delighted to have them with us today. Thank you for joining us. Our first speaker is Anna Foxley, Partnerships and Funding Coordinator at the Cash Learning Partnership, which is an organisation whose mission is to increase the use and speed on a radical scale of direct cash giving overseas and its application implications, and is going to be talking to us about what the Cash Learning Partnership is doing, and particularly the report that they've produced on State of the World Cash Report. So thank you for joining us today, Anna. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
Great. Our second speaker is Paola Castelli, Global Cash Advisor at Tier Fund, which is an organisation working internationally implementing market-based interventions, I think is the phrase, which includes cash and vouchers, to help people overseas. Paola's got a wealth of experience in the field, working at Tier Fund and previously at AVSI, an Italian organisation that worked overseas. So we're delighted to have you here today as well, Paola. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome. And finally, our third speaker is Ailey Kennedy, Deputy Director of the Interagency Regional Analyst Network, known as IRAN. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And also an Action Against Hunger. Ailey's got a wealth of experience as well, and in her role as kind of Chief Analyst for IRAN, is going to be talking to us about some of the policy and cultural implications, also talking to us about direct cash giving in the form of remittances, which we're going to cover here today. Ailey, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you for joining us, everyone. So now to the theme. Feel free to ask us questions as we go throughout. Just a bit of housekeeping. We have disabled the hand waving function, I believe it's called. So if you can't hear us, if you're having any problems, please do send us a message via the webinar program, and we'll be able to respond to that and react. The chat program. Thank you. Okay, so on to the subject of direct cash giving. Now, this was something that I didn't know a huge amount about before I started doing the research for this webinar today, but I find absolutely fascinating. And I understand that it is something that has increased over the last 10 years. People have started to think about what is the best way to help beneficiaries in developing countries overseas. Traditionally, we've always thought of delivering aid in the form of goods or services, what you might call in-kind gifts, whether it's grain, food, materials, that kind of thing, or training. But actually, the provision of cash or physical money, be it cash physically or digitally now, in 2018, is something that's increasingly on the rise. The World Food Programme itself gives 1/3 of its budget as cash transfers, which is surprising and may well become the World Cash Programme if that trend continues. And in 2016, a number of signatories of international organizations and donor and aid organizations, providers, came together and signed something called the Grand Bargain at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, where they said that there has got to be a different way of delivering aid and increasing the effectiveness of the humanitarian response. And one of the things that was signed in the Grand Bargain is a commitment to increase the routine use of cash alongside other tools such as in-kind gifts, training, services and support. So we thought it would be good to come together and discuss what is direct cash giving and how does it work. Anna, perhaps you could kick us off with your thoughts from the Cash Learning Partnership on how it works and the global context. First of all, before we move to Anna, we'll be asking a question, and the question of you and the audience is, where do you currently stand on the issue of direct cash giving in international aid? We have 4 options for you if you'd like to select one of those now. The options are yes, I'm for it, no, I don't believe it's a good idea, I'm not sure, I need more information, or I don't know. Both sides make good points. So please select one of those answers now. It'll give us an understanding of your thoughts on the issue as we start. Okay, thank you so much for your responses. Well, overwhelmingly, we have 62% who are not sure and need to know more about it. Perfect, you are in absolutely the right place. So to kick us off, Anna, please do start with direct cash giving from the position of the Cash Learning Partnership.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'll give you a brief introduction on the Cash Learning Partnership. This was set up in 2015 after the Asian tsunami, where cash transfer programming was found to be an appropriate response, but technical expertise was lacking. CAF was set up by 5 organisations that were British Red Cross, the Norwegian Refugee Council, Action Against Hunger, Save the Children and Oxfam. Its focus initially was very much on capacity building and building technical expertise, but it's now developed to become more of a network with over 70 members. And we also, as you'll see from the slide, we've now got 4 strategic objectives. So we've broadened out from capacity building to include knowledge management and research, focus on coordination and influencing policy. We've also grown in our geographical sort of reach. So we've got offices in West Africa, in Senegal, East Africa, in Kenya, in Switzerland, in Geneva, in the UK. We're in Oxford and London, in the US, in Washington, DC, and most recently in Jordan, in Amman. If we can just move on to the next slide, I want to set the scene for today's discussion by presenting some findings from a recent report that CAF published. This was published in February this year, and it's called the State of the World's Cash Report. It's the first report of its kind on cash. And in order to sort of try and produce a quality product, we interviewed a lot of people, as you can see from the slide, a number of cash experts. We surveyed practitioners, we surveyed organisations, focus group discussions, and from that, 6 sort of critical debates came through, and 8 in-depth case studies came through. I won't be able to go into it in depth today, but you can look at our website if you'd like to look at it further. And just moving on, before I give you more information, just for a little bit of audience participation, can you guess what percentage of humanitarian assistance was given through cash transfer programs in 2016? We've got 4 options, which are, was it 2%, 5%, 10%, or 20%?
What does the audience think? Let's see. I think we've all got our own ideas here as well. Okay, if you'd like to select your choice. And there we go. It looks like over half the audience believe it's 10%.
Great. So yeah, 52% of you went for 10%, which is the right answer. So
Excellent.
there we go. That's encouraging. So just moving on, yeah, this slide is it's a summary of sort of the six key findings from the report. I'll just focus on a couple because time is not on our side. But as you can see from point 1, in 2016, the global spend on cash and voucher programming increased by 40% to 2.8 billion against 2 billion in the previous year. So cash is increasing, and I think in percentage terms it was about 6 or 7% the year before. You'll also see from point 2 that that cash is being considered more often, not necessarily systematically, and from the bar chart you can see that it is used in certain sectors more than others. So those are some sort of interesting facts. Again, if we can just move on to the next slide. There's a number of critical debates. I won't touch on those heavily actually because I want to talk a little bit more about barriers. So if I could ask just to move back actually to the previous. In terms of barriers to cash, what we're finding is there's capacity is an issue within organisations. So it's having the right skill set amongst staff to deliver cash programs and also building that skill set. And another sort of big picture issue is around coordination. It's quite a shift in the system, and roles and responsibilities really need to be clarified amongst organisations involved to deliver cash sort of most effectively. So I'll hand back now to Joanna.
Thank you, Anna. That's fascinating. So what we're seeing is it's an area that's growing rapidly. And actually, there's been a huge take-up in some sectors more than others. The food and shelter, particularly the sort of highest ones. So the provision of cash instead of food by things like the World Food Programme, which is interesting to me. And you mentioned that one of the barriers to wider take-up is the appropriate skills in the organisations delivering those programmes. What do you mean by it? What are the kind of appropriate skills that they don't necessarily have right now?
It's a very different way of working. So, I mean, if you're a sort of sectoral specialist, you know, you're trained to implement a particular program in a particular way, and then this is quite a shift. I'm not sure if other colleagues here might be able to give a little bit more input from their experience working overseas and sort of their knowledge of overseas programs, just to give you a bit of a.
Yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Paola, on what the skills are that are needed for these programs to be delivered. May not exist already.
I think it's a matter of practice and understanding of the market as a starting point. So the main skill you need is just the ability to analyze the market and to understand the context, knowing very well your community and the beneficiary you're going to serve in order to serve them in the best way possible.
I see. Understand. So there's market knowledge and market understanding is perhaps something that people aren't specialists in already. Wonderful. Thank you. Interesting. And Anna, just lastly, the Cash Learning Partnership itself was born out of a response to the tsunami of 2005. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Tell us a little more about that.
I wasn't working for them then, so so I don't know it firsthand. But I think what came from that was that organisations were sort of applying this new approach, but the sort of the know-how and the expertise wasn't there, and there was a gap identified. And yeah, the 5 organisations I mentioned kind of came together to try to sort of try to build that expertise and really sort of, you know, shift cash along. I think the people could see that it was, having a really positive impact. But it was really, how do we do this and how do we promote it? So I think it was quite sort of innovative for its time. And, sort of in the past, I've been in this kind of world for quite a long time, and very much the approach was you don't give cash. So it was quite a shift in thinking and quite a brave move, really, in many ways.
That's great. An amazing legacy to come out of something so devastating as the tsunami is this long-term shift in how aid is delivered and support is delivered overseas. That's great. Thank you, Anna. That's wonderful. We look forward to you being involved in our question and answer sessions later on. So do please send in your questions as we go. Over now to Paola at Tear Fund. Paola, do please tell us, I know Tear Fund is one of the organisations that is actually delivering these kind of programmes on the ground. Tell us how Tear Fund works and in this area and how the programmes work on the ground to our listeners, please.
Thank you. So Tear Fund is a Christian relief and development agency working in 50 countries around the world. We started doing cash because we believe that it provides the most flexible, personalized and empowering way of meeting people's needs. To start, I'd like to share with you the story of a family we help in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's the story of Muhindo and his family. He was forced to flee and to leave his house after an attack in his village. He ran away, leaving everything behind, he just wearing the clothes that he had. They lost everything. They lost their house, they lost their livelihood, they lost their community. And they had no chance to restart from scratch in the new place they reached. So the cash grant he received from Tear Fund give him the chance to get back on his feet and to give him the chance to buy food, hygiene items, deciding by himself what it was better for himself and his family. So giving cash to people restore sense of normality in such kind of a situation. And this family in particular was able to go to the market to decide by themselves what they need the most, because people know what they need much better than any other agency can think about. Was able to get healthcare, he was able to pay school fees for his children, giving them the chance to go ahead with their education while being displaced. People like him knows how to prioritize their needs. They don't waste money, and the grant is used wisely. Cash gives the chance to personalize the support. It boosts the local economy, the local market, and it achieves a better value for money. In some cases, we also have a very good secondary effect of improving relationship within the household. Tear Fund, for this reason, Tear Fund starts to use cash at a large scale in 2014. From there, we grown up to $5 million distributed last year. While for this year, we plan to distribute up to $7 million, which represent roughly the 10% of overall Tear Fund's portfolio. We use cash to help people in need after conflict or natural disaster. We use it anytime is appropriate and possible, and we use it all around the world. Starting from Colombia, where we use it to support displaced families from Venezuela, up to West and East Africa, up to Iraq, and more recently we start using it in Bangladesh. We work through our national partners. We make sure to be close with the community we serve. We select with them vulnerability criteria in order to identify the people in the greatest need to support them. We use cash to empower community, giving them the chance to restart.
That's wonderful, thank you. And I'm interested in terms of on the ground, how does it physically work, the actual act of giving cash to people? Is it just a question of people coming together, queuing up in a line, receiving a bag of grain or some cash, or is there more to it than that?
Depend on the context where we are. Each distribution might be different from another. We have a certain method that normally we use. We can partner with a bank or a transfer agency if we go for a physical distribution. Or we can use mobile money if there is a network coverage, which means transferring grants through mobile phone. Or we can use a smart card or a debit card in case it's appropriate for the beneficiary and for the context where we are. Otherwise, we can also work through local traders and vendors, asking them to advance liquidity that they have already on ground and then refund them back as much as we do while working with the bank.
Okay, so using the existing outlets, as it were, where people will transact to deliver the cash transfer. That's fascinating. And we talked a little bit when we were discussing the preparation of this about the level of security you have to consider because you are handling physical cash in those situations.
Yes, we are very much aware about security for both our beneficiaries and our staff. Before starting and thinking about a cash distribution, we collect as much as information as we can from our partner on the ground, for the community themselves, and from other fellow agency, in order to have the latest news and the most updated possible. We map which are the potential risks and which are our mitigation measure in order to be able to respond to them. Mm-hmm. It's also important to say that cash might be more discreet than other type of aid, so it can be a good option for beneficiary, because once you receive your grant and you go to the market, you are invisible and you can just walk through the market as any other person. Okay. So you're less possible be a target of harassment.
Yes, which I think is important, isn't it, if you're trying to help in the long term.
Yeah.
And one final question. We had a question in advance, actually, which I think is interesting. How do you work out the appropriate amount of cash to give to a beneficiary?
The calculation of the grant is based on the monthly average expenditure or the minimum expenditure basket, which represents the amount that a household needs to survive and to meet their basic need over a month. So we use it as a figure to give us the chance to calculate appropriately the amount to be given to our beneficiary according to what we want to achieve and according to which objective we want to achieve with our intervention.
Okay, so if it's to support the household for a period of time, it's in line with what you would expect their expenditure to be, and it's disproportionate, is that right?
Yeah, we try to guess how much a household needs to cover basic need over a month, and this is roughly what we are going to give out to them.
Great, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. Wonderful, thank you so much, and I look forward to joining us for the questions later on. Moving now to Ailey Kennedy. Hi, Ailey. Ailey's the role in Iran has a very strategic view of humanitarian issues, and in particular has a view on direct cash giving. And we were talking earlier about direct to donor recipient giving without the use of NGOs, which we're going to talk more about remittances, and also through the kind of programs that Tier Fund are running and the Cash Learning Partnership is promoting. Ailey, tell us a little bit more about the impact of direct cash giving and why more organisations are campaigning for it, as with the Cash Learning Partnership, and growing the delivery of it overseas, and what some of the implications are.
Certainly. So as Joanna just mentioned, the consortium that I work for doesn't look necessarily directly at cash giving uniquely. We really take a systems view of the kind of information that we are able to gather, and therefore look at how programs and interventions such as cash really intersect with the other dynamics that are ongoing in the system. In terms of impact, I think my colleagues have summarized it quite well already, but really cash has been shown to be a very efficient format of intervention. The evidence that has been gathered so far by initiatives such as CALP and by organizations who have been using cash programming show that the money that is given out is not wasted. The money is well spent. There tends to be a fear around cash giving that with the sort of the giving of unrestricted money in particular, that people will spend the money badly. This has not been borne out to be true.
Okay.
Equally, cash gives people who are receiving humanitarian aid greater choice. And this is a really fundamental point, because the choice in and of itself is something that we as a sector are endeavoring to try and build for communities themselves. Anna said, and that essentially, part of what brought this about is that we want to try and increase some of the dignity that's associated with humanitarian aid. We have seen that when people receive goods in kind that they don't necessarily need, they will sell them on in order to get cash to spend and therefore plug the gap that they're trying to fulfill.
Right.
So really, cash programming is a way of delivering this kind of support far more efficiently. And Paola highlighted that people often know their own needs more than an agency, because individuals and households can have needs that are different to their neighbors and those that are different to their broader community. So I think there are three main points on the impact of cash: the efficiency, the choice it gives, and the dignity that it provides to the people who are receiving aid, which can in and of itself have a greater psychosocial value for people who are receiving that kind of intervention opposed to in-kind donations. As I mentioned, we tend to look at these things from a system view. So we really ask ourselves a question. Cash is not new. Cash has been something that has been around for decades, in fact. And one of the modalities in which it's transferred is through remittances. And remittances are not something that are often considered part of the more formal humanitarian sector. The amount of money that's given in remittances is quite difficult to accurately calculate. But huge volumes of money are transferred from diaspora communities to people on the ground. So why has the humanitarian community itself been quite slow in the uptake of cash programming when the benefits have been quite clear and when we see that it operates as a way of developing a security net for people on the ground? And I think there are a couple of points. One, there's quite an ingrained culture that distrusts the ability of poor people to make good decisions, which in and of itself, I mean, it affects us here in the UK. It's a global phenomenon where people seem to perceive that poverty is not brought about through a lack of resources, but rather poor decision making. There's a misperception about cash and the fact and whether or not it is easier to commit fraud or for aid diversion to take place. Again, this has not been proven to be true. Cash programming tends to be extremely well monitored, and the misuse of it is something that has not been occurring at scale and has been well reported. The humanitarian sector itself is extremely slow to shift. We do a lot of work that looks at what the sort of entrenched and vested interests are of the humanitarian system, both donors and NGOs and the UN. It was touched on that, staff and expertise is a problem among humanitarian actors, but equally, we're not well structured for a cash revolution as we stand at the moment. It would require a real fundamental shift in how we operate and how we organize ourselves. And finally, probably most importantly, it requires letting go of a significant amount of power and control over the humanitarian system, which actors have proven themselves, including NGOs, to be very reticent to do. It hands the decision-making over to the people who are receiving the aid, opposed to decisions being taken by donors and by NGOs in HQs and capital about what is needed by these communities. I know that I'm running low on time, so I'll just say one thing on technology. I think that there are lots of platforms that are being discussed, such as blockchain as an example, which could be used to be quite transformative in this space, giving greater transparency and cutting down on the middlemen who operate within that zone. However, there is also a lot of hype around the amount of usage that can be taken from these at the moment. I would relate it back to the sort of structure of the humanitarian community. We still do a lot of work based on paper, particularly in countries that operate. So when we're talking about moving towards some of these technologies, there can be a long way to go, because we're not necessarily even on Excel, for example, for the moment, let alone prepared to implement something through a blockchain at scale. So I think it's not a panacea to the challenges that face our shift, because a lot of that is political and cultural. But there are exogenous trends around such as urbanization, increased wealth in many of the countries of operation, increased levels of education, increased connectivity over the internet, and greater investment in financial technologies, which means that whether or not the humanitarian community plays a role or not, people are going to start making choices and having greater access to things like this. The question that we face today as a sector is how we can try and sort of accentuate and accelerate that trend to transfer powers to community, or if we're going to be a hindrance to it.
Fascinating, thank you. So what you're saying is there is a demand for this, and the benefits of it are that it's potentially more efficient because people aren't taking the in-kind good or the washing machine or whatever it is you've given them, going and selling it and realizing the cash. It puts the choice in the hand of the recipient, which I think is a really key issue, that ability of the recipient to decide what's exactly right for them as an individual or them as a family, which, as you say, may be vastly different from their next door neighbor, but as an organization on the ground, you would think that they might have very similar needs. And if the community or the donor community wanted to achieve that efficiency of getting exactly the right help to the right donor, that level of specialization that would be required, and research and planning and understanding, if you were giving an in-kind gift, would be, I imagine, beyond the bounds of most organizations to be able to achieve. So give the person the cash and they can make the choice of what to do with that flexible medium. And the efficiency point you raised, I think, for me, what's interesting is the donor knows best culture that I think we have been working towards and has been in existence for a long time. And you talked about that as possibly one of the big barriers to the take-up of more cash programs. Are there any situations where a cash program is not the right intervention to use? It's not the best thing?
Yes, I mean, I think that, Paola mentioned this a little as we were preparing, but context is key in a lot of these places. That I think that cash is only 10% of the overall humanitarian spend at the moment. That could be far, far greater. But there are some cases where cash is potentially not necessarily the most efficient modality to use. Something around public goods, for example, is an area where sometimes we see that cash is potentially either not sufficient or not the right kind of intervention. For example, if your goal is around education, provided there's access to education and there are schools to which children can attend, the giving of cash can certainly increase the number of children who are able to attend school, because the financial burden on the family is reduced, or the family can pay school fees that are required. However, if what's required is to expand an education system, the giving of cash to individual households doesn't necessarily translate into the creation of public goods and spaces in the most efficient way. So there are some areas where I think cash needs to be a complementary intervention to either in-kind or government support, which is coming through that format. Health is another example of this. Obviously, health can be obtained privately through the use of cash, and often a subsidy is necessary in order to enable communities to access that. However, if there isn't sufficient health infrastructure, the simple giving of cash is unlikely to be sufficient in the short term, at least, to be able to incentivize the market to create that. So there are different types of interventions and then different contexts in which it's relevant. I think in an urban environment, it's an area where we've seen a lot of cash programming be tested and explored, because there's often a market that's created in that space.
Wonderful, thank you. So it will never be the panacea, but it could absolutely fundamentally be a really large part of what we're doing.
Absolutely. And I think as you look at the way in which the world itself is changing, I mentioned urbanization. I think that's really critical in this conversation. We are seeing more and more of the humanitarian need being concentrated in urban spaces, and the creation of, or the intervention in kind is not nearly as efficient in an urban environment as cash could be. So I think for us, it's a question of how quickly the formal humanitarian system, being donors and NGOs and the UN, can really adapt to the changes in the context in which we're working, and really try and use these new modalities to achieve our goals more efficiently.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. Wonderful. Right. We have got lots of questions flying in, which is great. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. We'll be coming to the questions shortly. But first of all, we have a question for our audience before we do so. Whether or not you've donated to direct cash programs in the past, on the basis of what our speakers have been telling you today, would you now? Yes is an option, no, or I'm not sure. And the answers are coming in. Make your vote now, please, and then we can quickly gather the evidence. In the meantime, I've got a couple of questions just here. Paola, I have a question for you, actually, from one of our audience. On the countries in which you're using cash programs, Iraq was one of your more significant delivery areas. Why is so much going to Iraq?
In Iraq, we are supporting families affected by the recent crisis, and we have our biggest operation ongoing there. We receive funds from institutional donors, and we implement activity through our own personnel. While in other countries, we operate through our national partners, and we receive different kind of funds, and also implementing different activity at the same time.
Okay, so it's to do with the proportion of your programming and the size of delivery there. Wonderful, great. Well, the results of the poll are in to question 3. Whether or not you've donated to direct cash programs in the past, would you now? 26% are not sure, so still some conversion to be done there. But overwhelmingly, 74% say yes. Well done to my speakers, and 0% say no. So wonderful, great news there. We are getting converts to the cause. Okay, some other questions now to each of the speakers. Is there research evidence on which categories of beneficiaries make the most effective use of cash? Is there any kind of thoughts on different kind of beneficiaries? We've talked about the different contexts in terms of emergency humanitarian, and also delivering long-term to supporting households in a kind of a developmental context. But I think that's something that at the moment there isn't particularly researched, but we could look into. Perhaps, is there a gender difference between men and women? So if you support women as opposed to men, does that make a difference? Anna, would you like to take that?
What I could do is CALP has access. We have a library of resources on research that's available, and I'd be really happy to go back and check what's available to help answer that question.
Great.
Also, in terms of gender, we recently held what we called a symposium in Nairobi on gender and cash. That it was something that kind of just grew quite organically, and we were really quite encouraged and slightly sort of surprised by the level of interest. But there is there's sort of a lot to consider around gender relations and that issue of not putting people in a position of risk by giving them cash, but also looking at roles in the household as to who is the most appropriate recipient to make the most of the cash because of maybe the decisions that they may make.
Yes.
So.
Thank you. And Ailey, I know in the world of microfinance, there's been some evidence around female-led households and the different impact that has as opposed to male-led households. Is it similar with direct cash giving?
I There has been some. I don't think there is sufficient research to sort of come out conclusively one way or another on sort of where in a household globally one should place money, because as Anna was saying, there is certainly there's a cultural element that comes into play when considering that. But certainly there has been research around the female-headed household as being the recipient of cash. To be honest, often this has more to do with what type of intervention you're trying to run. So what are your goals in terms of cash giving? Female heads of household tend to be more responsible for care of children, for the provision of food within a household space. And so if that's what you're targeting, then a female headed household could be a more appropriate recipient of direct cash aid. However, if you're thinking more long term, or it's support around livelihoods or travel, then it would depend on the sort of the income generating structure of that particular household.
Right. Okay. Paola, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I was thinking about a story from a family we helped in Ethiopia, and the protagonist of the story is a woman in her late 60s called Helena, and she was explaining on how she was happy about receiving a cash grant because she was able to provide and fulfill their basic need for herself and for her 6 dependents. And something that struck me was about the relationship with her husband. Because being unable of providing for his family bring him not to reach home anymore, because he felt ashamed because he was not able to provide for his family.
Gosh.
While receiving the grant make him, he told, feeling like a man again, feeling like being able to provide to his family, and this makes themselves coming closer again together. They also be in position to have some saving, and not only they fulfill their basic need, but they were also able to cement the floor of their house to be able to face the next rainy season.
Oh, that's a wonderful story. And I think it's far from being some critics of direct cash giving have called it a handout or exporting the dole. Actually, what it's done there, and it's, as you sort of mentioned earlier, is given that family and that man dignity in his own home and making those choices and actually making long-term choices for the good of his family. So that's a wonderful story to hear. Thank you. We have more questions here. When is it appropriate to stop giving direct cash support? Interesting question. Who would like to take that one?
I might
Paola?
start, and then my colleague can go ahead.
Please go ahead.
I think that the important thing is do not to think about cash as something that can solve everything on its own. It's always important to know the context where we are operating and accompany a first emergency program to a longer term program. So the integration between an emergency response and a longer term program, it's key, according to my experience. I normally think about humanitarian intervention as an emergency room in a hospital, where you first need to stabilize your patient and then go for further treatment. And is not different in the humanitarian and development aid.
Okay, yeah.
So
that makes sense. Any other thoughts on when it's appropriate to stop?
I would just add, I mean, again, it very much depends on context. We often think about migration as a humanitarian issue, as in-camp placement as being something that's temporary and short-term, whereas all of our evidence would suggest that this is not true. The time that people would spend in a refugee camp, for example, can be years, if not decades, opposed to months. And so when we talk about ending cash programming, it really depends on the situation, the environment in which people live. Obviously, the aim would be to be able to reduce cash programming as a family's income increases and their resilience increases, such that they're no longer in need of a subsidy to help them to meet their basic needs and to be able to have enough of a cushion such that a sort of a failed rain or a missed season wouldn't necessarily devastate them and push them back into poverty. But in an environment such as migration, where potentially the national laws in a hosting country might restrict refugees from being able to access legal employment, it can be very difficult to think about phasing out cash programming, because if you are not given an alternative source of income, then the sector itself is creating a dependency on that income. And it is not the fault of the family or of the beneficiary who is receiving it that they're unable to move from it. It might be that the context in which they're living means that they are unable to really access other forms of income stream, which they could then use to stabilize their families long term.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, that I understand. That would make sense. You wouldn't want to just take it away with no other alternative in place, but actually, if there is an alternative place, phasing that out. And I was reading as I was doing the research for this that actually, in some instances, an one-off injection of cash can still lead to longer-term benefits and increase in wages. For example, they are then able to invest in traveling further to get a better paid job, which will increase their economic standing longer term. So fascinating. Another question we have, what about giving to a project such as building a dormitory for an orphan or buying a tractor or generator? How do you check and estimate that the expenditure is accurate and genuine? I think that's a question around delivery projects, and we'll probably do some research and come back to that question a bit later on. Another question around the local governments in these beneficiary countries. In some cases, the local governments will not allow for cash programming to take place. What are the typical reasons for their reluctance for this type of engagement or aid? Have you come across those situations at all? Perhaps at Tier Fund.
Yes, there are countries in which the government doesn't allow the use of cash, and therefore we cannot go for it, because of course we need to respect the law of the country in which we are working. It might be, again, the mindset that we have and the government might have as well, because we keep thinking to know better than our recipient what is better for themselves. So the same shift of mind that the humanitarian sector has to go through has to happen also at national level within the government itself. And there are places in which government actually help in distributing cash, so we can have a cohesion and a cooperation between humanitarian agency and the government itself, in which the government helps in distributing cash to through an already existing social and safety net. In example, it's a through case I have in mind Ethiopia, in example.
So working with the local infrastructure to really embed it in a way that's most effective?
Yes, exactly.
And I know that work with the Cash Learning Partnership is a lot around building the capacity for these kind of programs to take place, and the efficacy and the take-up to really accelerate it where it's going to be most used.
Yeah, that's right. And our one of the functions of our regional offices is to engage with the range of organisations that function in those situations. That can involve local governments as well. So to work with them and increase learning and that kind of thing. So.
Wonderful. And we have a question for Paola here. You've obviously sparked some interest. Actually, it was something we were talking about in the preparation, but the question is, how do you check the recipient is not receiving funds from other charities or sources? And we talked about actually sometimes they are receiving other kind of benefits, and actually that's something that you positively engage with. Is that right? Please do tell us more about those kind of situations.
The fact that beneficiary receive aid from other agency is not a problem. It's something that we have to take into consideration when we think about the grant to be delivered. So if we know that a family is already recipient of aid from another agency, we can adjust the grant that we give out according to what we want to achieve in our program, and considering the beneficiary preferences, of course. So the point is coordinating between agency, which is not always easy, but it's important to make sure to give the best help for the recipient, and coordinating might have a better result for the beneficiary themselves. So if more than one agency help the same family, as long as we understand and we work together, is not a problem. It might even give a better effect.
Yes, it could be joined together, but it does require that coordination piece, which can sometimes be a challenge, but great. But you do take it into account if there are other forms of aid they're receiving, as you sort of said there.
Yes, we do. When we are mapping and targeting our beneficiary, we also find out if they are recipient of any other source of aid.
Great, thank you. Sort of, it's probably a right straightforward question. When somebody is given direct cash, what do they tend to spend it on? We mentioned the concrete floor to protect from the rainy season. But are there any other kind of examples that typically recipients will spend the funds on? Anna, did you have any thoughts?
Food tends to come high up. So if it's available in the markets to be sold, then that would be a very that's the sort of sector that seems to get the most coverage with cash.
Right.
I would also just add to that, I mean, something that Action Against Hunger has seen, who's one of our partners on the ground, is that when you are able to give in cash, it's not only the level of consumption that increases, but also the diversity of food that's eaten. And by that, we tend to mean that the nutritional quality of the food improves when people have more money to spend on it.
Oh, I see.
Which means that they're making choices to essentially provide more nutritious food for their family. So buying a greater variety of vegetables and things that are encouraged even in this country around how to have a healthy diet is something that we see increasing quite significantly in that space.
So the money enables them to make better choices around the things that they're buying as well as spending more.
Exactly.
That's great to hear. Wonderful. Are there any countries in which direct cash giving works best? I mean, Tier Fund works in lots of different contexts. Are there somewhere it works better than others? And if so, why?
According to me, it doesn't really depend on the country itself, but from the context in which we are operating. So It doesn't really matter the nation or the side of the world where we are operating. What matters is the context in which we are working, and which are the needs from our population, and which is the preference of our beneficiaries.
Okay, thank you. So it's definitely to do with the aspects of that country rather than specifically the geography. And one question I have, which I was thinking about, is it cheaper to give direct cash than in kind? You mentioned efficiency before, Ailey, where even if you've sourced an in kind gift, somebody will sell it in the market to realise the cash. But is it physically cheaper to deliver?
In the long run, yes, because you have fewer staff, you sort of have fewer transport costs and storage costs, and you know the actual physical act of getting in-kind goods to populations in and of itself is a cost that NGOs and the humanitarian community bears. So I think in that frame, it is certainly cheaper. There's been some thinking around the idea that from within a community, you know, if everybody, for example, one needs blankets, you know, economies of scale would suggest that it is cheaper to buy blankets in wholesale and then distribute them opposed to having each family buy it on the market. However, as we've discussed, the needs tend to vary such within a community that very rarely tends to be the case. So I would say yes, it does tend to certainly be a more sort of cost-efficient modality for us to explore. You also ultimately will need fewer staff hosted within NGOs. NGOs could run a slimmer structure. I think the difference is that what's required to go along with cash programming is also information. If there is a monopoly in a market, then obviously that can radically increase the price for local people to buy a good sort of in that market space. So I think that's the only trade-off, is that you sort of need a bit of both in terms of a cash influx, an operating market, and the information required in order to make an efficient decision. So yeah.
Right, Paola, do you have any thoughts on cost efficiency you see in the field?
Yeah, I agree. It's cheaper than in-kind distribution. In example, if you think about how much it can cost you to load a truck, to hire a truck, to make it travel for days in places where roads are impossible to travel on, the number of people you need to employ to distribute in-kind is higher and largely bigger than what you need to distribute cash. And it's faster because you can time is essential when we are helping a community in crisis, especially. Delivering cash is much more quick in terms of the timing of the preparation you need. You reach faster your beneficiary rather than buy the items, prepare the kit, load the kit on the truck, send the truck, offload the truck, distribute the kit themselves. It takes a lot of time rather than agreeing with a bank or a agency transfer or transferring money with SMS, in example.
I think that's a very key point, actually, because particularly when I myself see responses to humanitarian crises, there's often a frustration, isn't there, around the speed of the ability to respond from yourself as sort of practitioners as well as the donor community. So if there is something that can be much faster and get to where it's needed at speed, I think, provided there is the market, as you say, to enable them to spend that money on something useful and meaningful, then that seems to me an excellent thing to be able to do. So wonderful. Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions you've had. We are now moving on to our final question to you, the audience. Thank you to my speakers. Last question for the audience. Now that you've heard from our fantastic panel of speakers on direct cash giving, where do you now stand on the issue of using direct cash giving in international aid? So just to ask the question we asked you right at the very beginning, is it yes, you think it's a good idea? No, you still don't think it's a good idea, despite our best efforts to convince you. I'm not sure, I need to know more, or you don't know because both sides make good arguments. Please just make your choices now, and we can collect that poll. And while you're doing that, I would just like to say thank you so much to Anna, to Paola, and to Ailey for a fascinating discussion on direct cash giving. I've certainly learnt a huge amount, and I'm really inspired by actually the impact that it's having on the ground and the way that it can be used alongside substantial existing programs in the right context. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. If you are interested in hearing more and want to know more about what you've heard today, either get in touch with us at CAF or please contact one of the organisations through their websites. We're putting up the web addresses now, so you can see there's CALP, Tear Fund and IRAN. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And the answer to the question is that as a result of what you've heard from the speakers today, previously, 14% said that yes, you would be interested because it's more effective and efficient. And we have transformed that to 86% of the listeners. So absolutely fantastic, with only 7% saying no and 7% saying they're not sure. So thank you. That's been absolutely great. Thank you for listening. Thank you to our speakers. We hope you've enjoyed it. This webinar has been recorded, and we'd like to let you know about the next webinar we're having, number 2, which is on the refugee crisis. We're currently seeing higher levels of refugees than at any time since the Second World War. So please join us for a discussion on that from practitioners in the field. That's taking place at 12 p.m. British Summer Time on Thursday, the 26th of July. And finally, before you go, do please complete our short survey to let us know if this is the kind of thing you'd like us to do more of, how we're going on doing it well, and if we can do anything better. So thank you to everyone, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.